So you want to really get to grips with 9/11, understand the core issues, but without, getting lost in all the noise and speculation online.
Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed. There's just so much out there.
Exactly. Well, you're in the right place. We're doing a deep dive today, focusing specifically on the claims made by former Congressman Kurt Weldon in a recent interview. We're going to try and pull out the main points he made.
Okay. And obviously 9/11.
Yeah.
It was a profoundly shaping event for the U.S., wasn't it? Changed everything.
Absolutely. Foreign policy, domestic policy, security, everything shifted.
And even all these years later, people still have, well, let's say, significant questions about what really happened and why.
That's right. And our goal here today isn't to jump into the political fray or take sides.
No, definitely not.
You just want to lay out what Congressman Weldon alleged based on what he said were his own experiences, his own information. We're just reporting the content from that interview impartially.
Good. So first off, who was Kurt Weldon? It's important to understand he wasn't just some backbencher.
No, not at all. He was a pretty powerful Republican congressman.
And he was actually poised, right, to become the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, a very influential position.
A huge deal. And his focus on terrorism, national security, that didn't just start after 9/11.
Right. He talks about being at the World Trade Center back after the 93 bombing.
Yeah, and he knew people like Fire Commissioner Howard Schaefer, Ray Downey, key figures in emergency response and understanding these kinds of threats.
He definitely had connections and seemed tuned into these issues early on.
And he also brings up the Gilmore Commission.
Ah, yes, the Gilmore Commission. He played a role in getting that set up, didn't he?
He did, and he claims that its recommendations, its findings, they were basically just repackaged later and credited to the 9/11 Commission.
Interesting. So he's suggesting a lack of original work or maybe credit being misplaced even back then.
It seems that way. Okay, so let's dig into one of the main things Weldon talks about, the intelligence picture before 9/11.
The alleged failures, yeah.
Yeah.
This is central to his argument.
He talks about trying to set up something called a fusion center. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. Think of it like, well, a central hub. The idea was to get different agencies like the FBI and CIA sharing information, pooling their data.
To break down those infamous information silos.
Exactly. To stop agencies working in isolation, potentially missing crucial links because one agency doesn't know what the other knows.
Makes sense. But he says he ran into resistance.
Yeah, particularly he mentions the CIA. He brings up something called CI-21, a specific CIA program at the time, as being part of that resistance.
So he's framing this not just as like an accidental oversight.
No, more like a systemic issue. Maybe even active resistance to sharing intelligence that could have been vital.
Which really makes you think, doesn't it? How often do these kinds of information barriers exist in big organizations, and what are the potential costs?
It's a critical question.
Mm-hmm.
And this leads directly into his claims about Able Danger.
Right, Able Danger. This was a team, he says, based at Fort Belvoir.
And Weldon asserts that this team actually identified al-Qaeda cells
Including one in New York?
before the 9/11 attacks happened. That's the core claim.
Which, if true, is obviously huge. It suggests the intelligence wasn't just missing, it was there.
Possessed by this specific military intelligence unit. Names, connections, the whole picture, allegedly.
But then it gets even more disturbing, according to Weldon.
How so?
He claims Able Danger tried on 3 separate occasions to give this information to the FBI and the Justice Department.
3 times. And what happened?
He says they were blocked, deliberately prevented from sharing it. He even claims they know the names of the people who stopped those meetings.
Blocked. That's,
Yeah.
I mean, that raises incredibly serious questions. Why? Why would anyone block that kind of information transfer?
He doesn't necessarily give a motive, but the implication of obstruction is very strong.
And he brings in Louis Freeh to back this up, right?
Yeah, the former FBI director. Weldon quotes Freeh as supposedly saying that this very Able Danger information could have prevented 9/11.
Wow. Coming from a former FBI director, that carries a lot of weight.
It really does. It adds another layer to this narrative of missed signals, or maybe blocked signals.
He also mentioned General Keith Lambert,
Yeah.
Special Operations.
Right. Said Lambert identified al-Qaeda and specifically Mohammed Atta almost immediately after the planes hit.
Suggesting, perhaps, that some people within the system had a much clearer picture than was publicly acknowledged right away.
Then there's the Pentagon Inspector General, a guy named John Crane.
What about him?
Weldon says Crane filed a whistleblower report claiming he was told by superiors at the DIA, that's the Defense Intelligence Agency,
Really?
told to basically lie or at least mislead Congress about this pre-9/11 intelligence picture.
Okay, a whistleblower alleging pressure to mislead Congress. That points towards a major potential cover-up, if true.
And Weldon definitely uses that word, cover-up. He's incredibly blunt about the 9/11 Commission itself.
What does he say?
He calls it a 1,000% cover-up, his words, and says it was led by Philip Zelikow.
1,000%. That's about as strong as you can get. It shows zero faith in the official investigation.
Absolutely none. He believes there was a deliberate effort to hide the truth.
And he connects this to someone named Tony Schaefer.
Yes, Tony Schaefer. Apparently, Schaefer met Zelikow over in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And Weldon claims that when Schaefer came back to the U.S. planning to reveal certain things, his office got shut down, files seized, and there were efforts to basically trash his reputation.
So potential retaliation against someone trying to speak out.
That's the picture Weldon paints. It makes you wonder, how safe is it to challenge the official story, even inside the government?
It's a chilling thought.
Weldon felt so strongly about this, he actually gave a 1-hour speech on the House floor, a special order.
What did he say in the speech?
He called the whole situation a scandal bigger than Watergate.
Bigger than Watergate.
Yeah.
That really shows his level of conviction back then.
Absolutely. So, tying this together, Weldon isn't just suggesting mistakes were made.
No, he's implying something much more deliberate happened. A cover-up.
Now, on the motive for a cover-up, he's a bit more cautious. He says he believes there was one, but doesn't want to speculate on why, because it's hard to prove.
Okay, that's somewhat restrained, given the strength of his other claims.
But he does bring up Tony Schaefer's book again, Dark Heart, it was called.
Right, and the story around that book is pretty wild.
It is. Weldon claims Schaefer's commanding general actually approved the book for publication.
Okay, so it went through official channels, seemingly.
But then Weldon alleges the government stepped in, bought up 10,000 copies, and destroyed them.
Destroy them. A government buying and destroying books. That sounds extraordinary. If that happened, what kind of precedent does that set?
It's a major allegation, and what was supposedly so sensitive in the book that required destroying it?
What does Weldon say?
According to Weldon, it was simply that Schaefer mentioned Phil Zelikow by name and talked about briefing him.
Just naming Zelikow. That seems almost minor to trigger such a drastic reaction.
Unless, of course, controlling every detail about who knew what and when was paramount.
It suggests an intense effort to manage the narrative, if Weldon's account is accurate.
Weldon also talks about how his own suspicions grew after 9/11.
Okay, what fueled that?
He says, quite pointedly, that he started getting better, more reliable intelligence from a reporter than he was getting through the official government channels.
Wow. A sitting congressman getting better intel from the press than from the agencies. That suggests a serious breakdown.
Yeah, a breakdown in trust, information flow. Something wasn't right, in his view.
So what did he do?
He describes creating his own informal network. He called them his intelligence agency cockroaches.
Cockroaches. That's a colorful term.
His term, yeah. Basically, insiders feeding him raw data, unfiltered stuff.
And he used this data.
He says he did. Use it to go into classified briefings, sometimes even as acting chairman, and challenge the CIA, asking questions based on what his unofficial sources were telling him.
So actively using this back-channel info to push the official channels. That shows some serious determination.
Definitely. Now, let's shift to another really controversial area, the location of Osama bin Laden after 9/11.
Okay. The common story is Afghanistan, then Pakistan, right? Tora Bora.
That's the accepted narrative. But Weldon claims his sources told him something very different.
What did they say?
He says his intelligence identified bin Laden in Iran, specifically Lee's Iran in Baluchistan province, very shortly after 9/11.
Iran, not Pakistan or Afghanistan. That's a major departure.
A huge one. It completely changes the geography of where the U.S. should have been looking, potentially.
Did he take this to the CIA?
He says he did, raised it in a classified briefing.
In their response?
According to Weldon, neither confirm nor deny. Just ambiguity. And he says this happened again.
Yeah, about 3 months later. His sources then said bin Laden was getting medical treatment at a military hospital near Tran, also in Iran.
Same response from the CIA. Non-committal.
That's what Weldon claims. Which, if true, is pretty strange given the massive hunt for bin Laden underway. Why be ambiguous about such specific intel?
It raises questions, for sure. Then the stories get even more specific. He talks about a former knock.
A knock? What's that?
It's agency jargon, a non-official cover operative. Someone working undercover for the CIA but without official diplomatic cover. Deniable.
Got it. So what about this former knock?
Weldon says this person came to him wanting his help to get into Iran
Why?
because, allegedly, this knock was convinced bin Laden was there and wanted to go after him, or at least confirm it.
Wow. That suggests some people really believe this Iran intel strongly enough to risk going there.
It seems so. And then there's the Falcon expert story.
Falcon expert. Okay, this sounds unusual.
It is. Weldon talks about a U.S. citizen, an expert on falcons who had deep ties in the Arab world, particularly with falconers. This expert supposedly told Weldon that his contacts, the falconers over there, were seeing bin Laden's distinctive birds. Bin Laden was known for falconry flying in Iranian airspace.
Seeing his birds. As proof he was there.
That was the claim. And this expert apparently offered to use his network to help pinpoint bin Laden's location in Iran.
That's highly specific and maybe a bit unconventional intelligence. Hard to know how reliable that would be, right?
Definitely unconventional. But Weldon presents it as another piece fitting his puzzle about Iran.
Did anyone else corroborate this Iran theory, according to Weldon?
He claims that after he left Congress, he was contacted by Michael Scheuer.
The guy who headed the CIA's bin Laden unit, Alex Station.
That's the one. And also General McChrystal.
McChrystal. Wow, okay. And what do they supposedly say?
Weldon alleges they seem to confirm parts of his information about bin Laden potentially being in Iran, but
Well, what?
they were hesitant to get involved publicly or push it further, and they cited what had happened to Weldon and his family as a reason why.
Implying they feared similar repercussions, that adds another layer of potential intimidation, if true.
Exactly. It reinforces Weldon's narrative that challenging the official story carried significant personal risk.
Which brings us to what actually happened to Weldon politically. The raid.
Yeah, this is a crucial part of his story, just weeks before the 2006 election.
When he was set to become chair of armed services.
Bingo! The FBI raids his daughter's house.
The timing alone looks incredibly suspicious, doesn't it? Right before an election, targeting the family of a congressman poised for a powerful role.
Weldon certainly thinks so. And he makes a point of saying no charges were ever filed against his daughter.
Never charged.
Never charged. And the FBI apparently never even interviewed her about whatever the supposed basis for the raid was.
That seems odd. A raid, but no follow-up interview, no charges.
He also points out something else. Around the same time, the FBI also raided a Democratic lawyer in his district.
Okay. What's the significance of that?
Weldon claims this lawyer was actually working with FBI counterintelligence against Russia. So raiding someone cooperating with them seems strange, too.
It adds complexity. Was it related? Unrelated. It raises more questions about the FBI's actions at that time.
And despite this cloud of the raid hanging over him, Weldon says former President George H.W. Bush.
The elder Bush, former CIA director himself.
Right. Allegedly gave Weldon some kind of public tribute after the election, even with the raid unresolved.
Which seems contradictory if Weldon was genuinely suspected of serious wrongdoing, doesn't it? A tribute from Bush Sr.
It feeds Weldon's belief that the whole thing was politically motivated, a setup.
And he believes the motive was specifically to get him out of Congress.
Yes, because he was asking too many questions about 9/11, challenging the narrative, especially with the power of the Armed Services Chairmanship looming.
Does he offer any other evidence for it being politically motivated?
He points to a sudden, massive surge in campaign funding for his opponent, Joe Sestak, right at the end.
Last-minute money dump. That happens. But was it unusual?
Weldon implies it was suspiciously large and timed. And even weirder, he claims Sestak's campaign actually cut back on its TV ad spending the week of the raid.
Cut spending. When they just got a surge of cash, and right when their opponent is under fire. That does seem counterintuitive.
Unless perhaps the raid itself was expected to do the damage, making ads less necessary that week. That's the kind of speculation it invites.
And how does Weldon characterize Sestak, his opponent?
He paints him as being aligned with the, quote, national security state. He notes that Sandy Berger's former staff director was working on Sestak's campaign.
Sandy Berger. We'll probably get back to him. But linking Sestak to that establishment reinforces Weldon's narrative.
Right. He also says he talked to figures like Karl Rove in the Bush White House and even Robert Mueller about the situation.
So he was raising alarms at the highest levels about what he thought was happening to him.
It seems so. It really underscores the high-stakes political battle he felt he was in.
Okay, so fast forward to more recently. What's Weldon's perspective now? Does he still maintain these views?
Oh, absolutely. If anything, he seems more convinced. He mentions something deeply disturbing.
What's that?
The deaths of two of his key intelligence contacts. Both died, he says, from unusually aggressive, fast-moving cancers.
Oh, wow. That's it. I mean, is he implying?
He's careful. He says he can't prove they were assassinated or anything. But he brings it up in the context of his early work in Congress, holding hearings on asymmetric threats, including potential bioweapons or targeted energy weapons.
So he's suggesting the capability for such things might exist, even if he can't prove it was used here. It adds a very dark undertone.
A very dark one. He flatly reiterates 9/11 did not happen the way the official story claims.
Still maintains that fundamental position.
And he goes further. He alleges direct CIA involvement with some of the hijackers.
CIA involvement with the hijackers. That's an enormous claim. Does he offer proof?
He claims he has written confirmation of this. Again, a massive allegation that directly contradicts everything officially stated.
And one that would require extraordinary evidence to be taken seriously by mainstream investigators or historians.
Of course. He also, interestingly, brings up Alex Jones.
Alex Jones.
Yeah.
How does he fit in?
Weldon points to the fact that Jones seemed to predict, or have foreknowledge of, the attacks before they happened. He sees that as another anomaly worth investigating.
Jones' pre-9/11 statements are definitely something often cited in conspiracy circles. Verifying the nature of that knowledge is tricky, though.
Weldon also stresses his own exclusion from the official process. He says he was never asked, never allowed, to testify before the 9/11 Commission.
A senior congressman, former vice chair of Armed Services and Homeland Security, with all these claims, excluded from testifying.
That's what he says, which, if true, does seem like a significant omission by the Commission. Why wouldn't they want to hear from him, even just to rebut his claims?
It raises questions about how comprehensive their witness list really was.
He describes actually going to the public event where the 9/11 Commission report was released.
Yeah.
He says he confronted Lee Hamilton, one of the co-chairs, right there. He clearly felt shut out and ignored.
He wasn't quiet about his disagreement then.
Not at all. He also points fingers at key staffers on the commission, like Philip Silicow again, Jamie Gorelick, Dear Snell.
What was his claim about them?
That they, the staff, essentially controlled the narrative, steered the investigation, and shaped the final report more than the commissioners themselves. Basically, that the conclusions might have been pre-cooked.
That's a common critique of large commissions, that staff work can heavily influence the outcome. But Weldon puts it very forcefully.
He does, and he loops back to Louis Freeh again.
The former FBI director.
Yeah. Reiterating Freeh's alleged statement that the commission's work was incomplete, and that Weldon's Able Danger information suggested 9/11 could have been stopped.
Reinforcing that core argument about preventable tragedy based on ignored intelligence.
Then the conversation moves to the physical destruction itself, specifically World Trade Center Building 7.
Building 7. The building that wasn't hit by a plane but collapsed later in the day. Always a huge point of contention.
Exactly. Weldon says he agrees with the idea that it looks like a controlled demolition.
He aligns with that theory. That's a significant position.
Yes. He even mentions that Donald Trump apparently made similar comments years ago about it looking like explosives.
And he contrasts this with the official explanation.
Right. He mentions the NIST report, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which concluded fire caused the collapse. But then he cites a rebuttal study, allegedly from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, that challenged NIST's findings.
So he's highlighting the scientific debate that still exists around Building 7's collapse.
He is. He even throws in a personal anecdote about finding fire safety violations in congressional office buildings.
To make a point about potential negligence or overlooked safety issues being common.
Seems like it. Just raising general questions about building safety and oversight. Then he brings up Battalion Chief Oreo Palmer.
A firefighter who was high up in one of the towers.
Yes, in the South Tower, I believe. Weldon references Palmer's last radio transmissions, featured in a documentary called Bravo 7.
What was significant about those transmissions?
Palmer reported reaching the impact zone and finding multiple pockets of fire, but suggesting they were manageable shortly before the tower collapsed.
Which contradicts the idea of uncontrollable infernos leading inevitably to collapse.
That's how Weldon and others interpret it, as evidence potentially challenging the official fire-induced collapse narrative.
Do many firefighters agree with Weldon's views on controlled demolition or explosions?
Weldon suggests there's a subtle pressure on firefighters not to talk about things like that. He gives an example involving a former LA fire chief.
implying they might face career consequences for questioning the official story.
That's the implication. He also claims there are multiple recordings, tapes of people on the ground that day saying they heard explosions distinct from the plane impacts or collapses.
The accounts of explosions are definitely part of the alternative theories.
Now, he does acknowledge the big counterargument. How could such a massive conspiracy involving explosives or a cover-up on that scale be kept secret for so long by so many people?
That's always the major hurdle for these theories, isn't it? The sheer number of people who would have had to be involved and stay silent.
It is. But despite that, Weldon's bottom line remains the same. He wants a new investigation.
A new commission.
Yes, an independent presidential commission, he says, with full subpoena power, full authority to re-examine everything. He believes that's the only way to get the real truth.
So fundamentally, he has zero trust in the original investigation
Yeah,
and believes only a completely fresh start can uncover what he sees as the truth.
precisely. Just briefly touching on a couple of other points, he talks about acceptable casualties in conflict kind of philosophically,
Okay.
and reiterates his belief that when the full story comes out, 9/11 will be seen as the biggest scandal in American history.
He really believes it's that monumental. What about Flight 93?
He acknowledges the speculation that it might have been shot down, but says he personally doesn't have evidence for that. He notes the speculation exists, though.
Okay. And then he brings up Sandy Berger again, specifically.
Yes. Focuses heavily on Sandy Berger, who was Clinton's national security advisor.
What's the connection Weldon draws?
Several things. Technology transfer to China, the Cox Commission findings, campaign donations, a waiver for Laurel space and communications.
All complex issues from the 90s.
Right. But the main point Weldon hammers is Berger being caught stealing and destroying documents from the National Archives.
Documents related to what?
Pre-9/11 intelligence documents, specifically related to terrorism threats like the Millennium Plot. And Weldon emphasizes the lenient plea deal Berger got.
So Weldon sees Berger's actions as deliberately removing evidence that might have shown more pre-9/11 warnings were missed or ignored.
Exactly. He views it as a critical piece of a potential cover-up, obstructing the full understanding of what was known before the attacks.
It certainly adds another layer to his narrative of hidden or destroyed information.
So, wrapping it all up, what's Weldon's big picture view?
It sounds like he sees a powerful, unaccountable force within the government.
That's right. He talks about a deep state intelligence agencies acting in their own self-interest, prioritizing maybe profit or power over actual national security.
A permanent bureaucracy that operates outside of normal political accountability.
That's the idea he's putting forward. He challenges current members of Congress not to be duped by these forces.
And he's not done talking.
He says he intends to keep working to expose people he sees as corrupt. His ultimate hope, though, rests on that idea of a new independent commission.
Believing that's the only path to truly uncover the facts and maybe prevent future tragedies based on similar alleged failures.
That seems to be his final message. A call for truth and accountability, driven by his deep conviction that the official 9/11 story is fundamentally flawed.
It's quite a perspective, built over years of his own experiences and investigations.
So there you have it. We've just walked through the core claims and experiences shared by former Congressman Curt Weldon in that recent interview about 9/11.
Yeah, and it's clear his perspective coming from someone with his background in Congress and on key committees. It definitely raises some significant questions.
It certainly challenges parts of the official narrative that many people take for granted.
And now you, the listener, have heard this perspective laid out.
Right. We hope this gives you more information to think about. We really encourage you, though, keep researching, look for different viewpoints. 9/11 is incredibly complex.
Absolutely. Seek out multiple sources. Consider the evidence presented by the 9/11 Commission, the NIST reports, and weigh them against the questions raised by people like Weldon.
Which leads us to maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
Considering everything Weldon alleged, all the points he raised,
Yeah.
what single part of the official 9/11 story do you think most needs another critical look?
And maybe think bigger, too. What does it mean for us as a society if really fundamental questions about such a huge, traumatic national event are still being debated so intensely decades later? What does that say about trust and truth?